PTPOP here with all four lobes of my brain securely bound behind my back, and today I'm going to talk about the Cinderella story of the rock group The Beatles. Stay tuned.
Would you like fries with that? Would you like fries with that?
He's a Cinderella boy, tears in his eyes, I guess, as he lines up this last shot. He's got about 195 yards left, and looks like he's got about an 8 iron. This crowd has gone deathly silent. Cinderella story, out of nowhere. A former greenskeeper now about to become the Masters champion. It looks like I'm a wreck. It's in the hole!
So let me ask each and every one of you this, especially those of you who are musicians and have worked and played in a band. If I told you that there was a band out there that musically they weren't very good, that you had no idea whatsoever that they could write songs or they knew anything about writing songs. Maybe they had written a couple, but most of the repertoire were cover tunes. They were basically a cover band and not very good at what they did. They were mediocre musicians. They didn't write original songs. And they didn't really have much of a following. Nobody even knew who they really were. All of a sudden, one day they get signed by a manager, and within 2 months of signing that manager, within 6 months they're signed to a record label, that is, and then within a year of signing that record label they have a #1 hit in your country. Wouldn't that story sound kind of far-fetched? And I ask this because I'm a musician, and I've written over 150 songs. I've got 5 CDs of original music. I've worked in professional recording studios. I'm not famous, and I never will be, and I'm far from it. And that's fine. I'm fine with that. But I know the interworkings of the music business. I know all about working in a recording studio. I know how hard it is to work in a band. You know, those of you who've worked in bands, guys and gals, you know how hard it is to keep band members around. You know, some decide they just want to be in it. Some aren't very good, and you have to get rid of them. Some of them overdose, or some of them, you know, spontaneously combust on stage and disappear into a pile of cinders. And there is nothing at all easy or Cinderella about anybody who works in a band. It's not glamorous. It's not romantic. It's a lot of hard work. And there's a lot of ups and downs, and probably more downs than ups, especially if you're just playing the local bar circuit in your town. So this leads me to want to talk to you about the world's most famous band, the Beatles, and the Cinderella story of the Beatles. Now, for those of you who don't know the story behind the Beatles, the initial incarnation of the Beatles included 5 members. There was John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison. There was Pete Best on drums, and a gentleman by the name of Stu Sutcliffe. Now, Stu Sutcliffe was an art student who was a painter, but he also had aspirations to be a musician, though he didn't know how to play an instrument. He didn't know how to play the bass. He somehow convinced John, Paul, George, and Pete to become the bass player. They needed a bass player, so I guess the story is they drug him up on stage, where he would perform with his back to the audience when he played in Liverpool with them, so nobody could tell that he really didn't know what he was doing. Now think about this, guys and gals. You're in a band, you're in high school, maybe you're in college, and you have a band of 4 or 5 guys and gals, and you're trying to make it, and you're determined to make it big. You want to become famous, and one of your buddies comes up to you and says, "Hey man, I really need to get laid, dude. You need a bass player. I've got this old rickety bass guitar. Can I just come up on stage and stand there and look like an idiot with my back to the audience so girls will like me?" Okay, I don't know about you, but even if I was young and somebody said that to me, I'd be like, "Get the fuck out of here, dude. I mean, we're trying to make it. This is serious, man. I'm an artist, dude." You would tell your friend, "Hey, sorry, that sounds cool and everything. Well, we'd really rather appreciate it if you helped us, lug amplifiers around and passed out flyers so we get more people to come to our gigs." You wouldn't let that guy into your band. But John, Paul, George, and Pete decided to let this guy in the band. Now, this is the part, I'm being sarcastic when I say this is part of the Cinderella story. This is part of what doesn't make sense about the Beatles. So they're these 5 guys in a band without really a bass player, and they're playing in Liverpool. And in July of 1961, Stu Sutcliffe decided to leave the group and focus on his painting. He went back to his art, which is fine. He died shortly after that from brain hemorrhage, either from being attacked in a mugging or something along those lines. This story of his demise is kind of fuzzy. And Paul McCartney took over the bass playing for the group. So this is all early 1960. It's right around 1960. The band is originally formed in the seaport of Liverpool, England. Now let me show you where Liverpool, England is on the map. Okay, I'm going to switch over here. This is a map of the United Kingdom and Western Europe. And Liverpool, England is up here. I guess you would say that is northwestern United Kingdom, the northwestern part of United Kingdom over here. This is Liverpool. It's pretty much before the Beatles hit the map, nobody had even heard of this place. So to go back to 1960, Stu Sutcliffe has left the band, right? And all of a sudden, they get this guy. I think his name was Alan Williams. I might be wrong on the name, but he wasn't a manager, but he was a guy that got them gigs in Germany. Forgive me if I have the wrong name, if it was Alan Williams or not, but there was a gentleman who got them gigs in Germany. So this, right, and to back up a little bit, the Beatles at the time were this ragtag group of guys. Okay, at the time they had a bass player that couldn't play the bass. They had 3 guitar players and a drummer who was mediocre at best. Okay, and they were a ragtag group of guys that were mediocre musicians all across the board. And they wore leather. They wore black leather pants, leather coats. They had their hair greased back. They looked like, punk rockers of the 70s and the 80s. This was a ragtag group of musicians that weren't very good. The one thing that they had going for them is they had this witty personality and a lot of charisma on stage. A lot of, I guess, stage presence is what you'd call it. So this is not a great band. They're a cover band. They're basically a kind of a garage band that goes out and plays at a place called the Cavern in Liverpool, which is an old bomb shelter. They play at the Casbah Club, which I think was a coffee shop that I think Pete Best's mom opened up in the basement of her house or something like that. They were playing at, the backyards of churches, and they were playing at, the Cavern and things like that. They didn't have much of a following. They weren't getting anywhere in Liverpool. They weren't making any money at it, and they weren't well known. They weren't very good. These are the plain and simple facts. So they get this guy, I think his name was Alan Williams, who had connections in Hamburg, Germany. And he got them a gig I've heard stories that they were paid to play in Hamburg, Germany from anywhere from £70, British pounds per week to up to £100 per week. Now, in today's money, that is the value of the British pound. I'll take you over here to that. In today's money, that's $2,300 in 2023. Okay? So that's $2,300 virtually. So back then, let's say they were paid £100 in 1960. That's basically $25 per. Well, no, if there's 5 guys in the band, it's less than that. But let's say this is after Stu left. You got 4 guys, so they're making $25 per person, which is roughly £573 per band member. Which, when you think about it, now think about this. They traveled. Let me go back to this map here of how far they had to travel to get to Hamburg. Let's go back over here. They went from Liverpool, England, in like northwestern United Kingdom, over here, way over here, and they I don't know if this is the route they took, but my guess is they had to go all the way down here, cross the channel on a and I say ferry. I was going to say ferry on the Mersey, on a ferry. So they drove in this rickety old white work van with all of their equipment in it, their guitars, their cables, their amplifiers, their microphones, so on and so forth. 4 guys drove all the way from here, down here, crossed the channel on a ferry, entered France, went into Belgium, up through way up here in Hamburg, Germany. And based on DuckDuckGo, this map feature, that says that's 792 miles. And it would take 14 hours and 13 minutes to drive it. That's the fastest route. Okay. All this for 100 pounds a week. So, I mean, I guess back then, I guess that's pretty good money, and I think it was better than what they were making in Liverpool. But that's basically, 400 pounds per month, which I guess back then that's okay money. But what I don't understand, this is where the fairy tale for me gets a little bit foggy. And the funny thing, the thing that I always question about this band is their praise as being geniuses, especially John Lennon and Paul McCartney, George Harrison, are all being praised as geniuses, just absolute songwriting geniuses, just fell out of the womb writing songs. And there's stories I've read, and Mike Williams has confirmed that there are stories that the Beatles allegedly had already written 150 songs up to this point in time in their musical history. But their set list in Hamburg consisted over 99% of cover tunes. And here's the set list for the Star Club now. This is in the Reeperbahn district in Germany. And there's only a couple of originals on here. There's I Saw Her Standing There. Lord, where are the originals? I think Mr. Moonlight's an original. But look at the set list. This set list is almost all cover tunes. Bebopalula, Hallelujah, I Love Her So, Red Hot, Kansas City, Shimmy Like Kate, Reminiscing, Red Sails in the Sunset. There's hardly any, if any, original songs. There's a couple. Matchbox is a cover. Roadrunner, it's a soundtrack. The Hippie Shake by the Swinging Blue Jeans. A Taste of Honey, which I'm not certain if that's theirs, and I don't think so. I don't think they could write a song that good. Ask Me Why is original. Twist and Shout is not. Mr. Moonlight. So the point I make here is that throughout history, the Beatles have been lauded as these magnificent songwriters, just tremendous songwriters who have this rags to riches story, but a lot of the story doesn't make much sense. So it's one. Now, let me say this. Those of you that are musicians, you may or may not know this. You may not agree with me, but when you play cover tunes, that's not original. I mean, you're taking somebody else's song, and most of us, when we do a cover tune, we're trying to copy it note for note and try to sound as close to the original artist as we possibly can. The creativity comes in is when you try to make it original, sounding original. But when you're doing cover tunes, it's like if you're a painter, it's like taking a Van Gogh and copying Van Gogh's. There's no creativity involved in it because everything's already done for you. It's composed for you already. The color scheme is already selected for you. The layout is already done for you. The only real skill comes in is the skill that you've mastered with your palette knife and your brushes. Outside of that, it's not creative at all. But an original song, when you write original songs, it takes a vast amount of creativity and focus and ingenuity and intuition and all kinds of things. You're dealing with words, you're dealing with music, you're dealing with poetry. there's a whole different aspect to it than just covering songs. So you've got these guys that are heralded throughout history as being these magnificent, brilliant, genius songwriters, but all they're playing is cover tunes. Why is that? So you've got these ragtag group of leather-clad guys who can barely play their instruments, that are not very good. The club owners don't even like them. They don't even want them there, but they take them because they can't fill the bill with anybody else in other bands. Because you're in the Reeperbahn district, probably most people don't even want to go there. Unless you're just a bunch of drunken sailors coming in, and, whatever, in war-torn Hamburg, Germany. The war has only been over for a little while. 1960, it's only been over for 15 years. I'm sure Hamburg is still in rubble from the bombings and everything else from our bombers in World War II. So let's go fast forward here. So you've got this gentleman named Brian Epstein, who eventually becomes the Beatles' manager. This is Brian Epstein, and this is from BeatlesBible.com. And Brian Epstein was born on September 19th, 1934, on Rodney Street in Liverpool. So he's from Liverpool. So are the Beatles. He's about 6 or 7 years older than any of the Beatles. So he's an older gentleman. He's a very proper Englishman. He's also known to have been a closeted homosexual gentleman who actually liked younger men or boys. Now, I don't know what they mean by boys. I don't know if he means prepubescent, preteen boys, or if he liked young men like 18, 19 years old. I don't know. I don't know any of his preferences, and I've never researched it, but that's the rumors that I've heard about the gentleman. So let's get this straight. So Brian Epstein, a little background about Brian. Brian's family owned a furniture store. I can't say this with a straight face. Let me turn on my moon. I'm going to turn on my moon. I think my moon died. My moon is out. Mr. Moonlight is out. Mr. Moonlight. He's gone out on me. So Brian's family owns a furniture store in Liverpool. And they, at a later time in their careers, they purchased North End Music Store, which is known to most of us as NEMS, which was one of the biggest music outlets in northern England. And there you could rent, buy musical instruments, and you could buy records, you could listen to records, things like that. And over time, Brian Epstein's parents, who owned these two stores, promoted him to manager of these stores, or director of both stores, or director eventually of NEMS, North End Music Store. And prior to this, he had absolutely no experience in any way, shape, or form whatsoever of managing rock groups or bands at all. He knew nothing about it. So somehow this guy, Brian, who's been working in a furniture store and peddling, musical instruments to kids and selling records, somehow becomes the manager of the band that becomes an overnight phenomenon. Worldwide, 50 years later, people are still talking about them. So let's go a little bit over the fairy tale of how Brian Epstein allegedly discovered the Beatles. Okay. So Brian Epstein first saw the group, the Beatles, at the Cavern with a friend during lunch hour on November 9th, 1961. Now, the Cavern was a former bomb shelter that the Brits would climb into when the Blitz was going on to find safety, to hide from the German Blitz during World War II. It was dark, it was dank, it was filled with cigarette smoke. And the story goes that he walks into this cavern to see them, and he's a proper Englishman with a fine, Italian suit. He's very properly dressed. He's a very proper person. He's speaks the King's English, the whole 9 yards. He's very well spoken, educated, kind of a posh individual. He walks into this club filled with, this rough crowd of Liverpudlians. And there on the stage are the Beatles, which at this time now consists of John, Paul, George, and Pete. Pete Best on drums, and they're all wearing leather, tight black leather pants, leather coats. They're rough. They're rough around the edges. They're brusque. They're masculine. They're a tough looking group up there. And the story goes is he walks in there and he listens to a set. Excuse me. And he's just very taken with them. And he just becomes very enamored with their look and their charisma and their stage presence. And okay, now think about this. Okay, you've got a homosexual man. Think about this. This is a guy who had some eccentric sexual tastes in young men. He goes in there and sees these 4 young men that are at least 6 years younger than him. George Harrison, I think, was like 8 years younger than him. George Harrison was 17 at the time, I think. And so he goes in and he sees these guys in leather. And leather can be a big thing in the homosexual scene. I think this guy walked in, Brian Epstein said,
"Well, I saw the 4 boys in the leather trousers, and then I saw John in his leather trousers, and I was immediately aroused, immediately intrigued. I fell in lust with the man, and I offered to manage them if they would rough me up."
So how did he find the Beatles? How did he discover the Beatles? How did he know to go to the cavern? Well, the Cinderella story is Brian Epstein is working in his record store, and some kid comes storming in the store and is rifling through the records in the record rack and says, "Hey, man, do you have any Beatle records?" Brian's like, "The Beatles, who were they?" And he's like, "Oh, they got this song called My Bonnie," which is a whole nother story. The Beatles recorded this song with a guy named Tony Sheridan, and they recorded John on lead vocals as My Bonnie, and kids kept coming in and asking for it. And so anyway, so Brian was like, "Oh, who are these guys? The Beat Brothers and the Beatles, and what is this song, My Bonnie?" So somebody told him that they play at the cavern, and he ran over there to see him at the cavern. That's the official story. That's the official narrative. So keep in mind now. Look at this timeline, okay? I'm gonna bring up my timeline here. Brian first saw the group at the cavern with his friend Taylor during the lunch hour of November 9th, 1961, okay? Now, keep in mind that this is a guy who knew nothing about managing a rock group. He had never done it. He didn't know his ass from a hole in the ground about anything other than working in a furniture store and a record store. A couple months later, in January of 62, he signs the Beatles to a 5-year contract. What? I mean, okay, let's think about this, people. All right, so if you're a musician and you're in a band and you're struggling to make it big, okay, first thing you've done is you've invited your friend up on stage to pretend to play the bass with his back to the audience just so he can find girls and get laid. And the pictures I've seen of Stu Sutcliffe, nothing against him, but he was a tiny guy, maybe 5'4" at most. He was a little guy. And his bass was like massive, this giant, I think it was a Hofner bass or something, but it was a big full body bass. First thing you do to get famous and to make it in the business is you invite this guy in here who's not a musician. Then think of this. You're in a band, you're struggling, you're playing wherever city you're in. I'm in Cleveland. You're here in Cleveland, you're playing the bar circuit to get famous, and you're trying to get recognized. And a guy comes up to you. I come up to you out of the crowd. I don't know anything about being a manager of a band. I have no connections in the music business other than that I own a record store. And I come up to you and say, "Hey guys, I really like your sound. I'd like to manage you." So all the guys' ears or gals or whatever it happens to be in the band, their ears perk up. They come over. They're like, "Okay, great. So what kind of connections do you have in the music business?" "Oh, I own a record store." "Yeah." I would say, "Yeah." "Okay. Well, what can you do for us as manager? Why would we hire you as manager?" I mean, if anybody in the band has any sense about them, they're going to say, "Okay, this guy wants to manage us, but he has to have connections in the business to make it worthwhile." I mean, why would the Beatles sign a 5-year contract with a guy who just owns a record store and works in a furniture store, who's never managed anybody in his life? I'm like, I mean, you may as well just have a bum off the street, just pull somebody out of the gutter to manage you. It makes no sense. This story makes no sense whatsoever. Unless there was some type of romantic interlude, or he offered them something that he couldn't hold up to. And the story is he signs them to this 5-year contract, okay, in January 1962, and then he allegedly feverishly runs around England trying to get them a record deal somewhere. And he runs to all of his connections. Oh, you've got to listen. And he takes, I think he takes their demo from Decca Records. They had a demo with Decca Records of about 12 songs, 12 to 14 songs. And the demo stinks. I mean, it's not good. And Decca turned them down and told them that guitar bands were on their way out, something like that. But they didn't like them. They said, forget it. We don't have anything to do with it. And I guess Decca Records had been regretting it ever since they got famous. So anyway, Brian Epstein runs around England trying to get them signed to something. So that's January 24th of 1962. Okay. 5 months later, he gets them an audition with EMI Records. I'm sorry, EMI. Now EMI. Sorry, EMI Group Limited was originally an initial for, or an abbreviation of, Electric and Musical Industries, also referred to as EMI Records Limited, was a British transnational conglomerate founded in March of 1931 in London. At the time of its acquisition by Universal Music in 2012, it was the 4th largest business group and record label conglomerate. Now, it doesn't say in what I pulled off of here, off of Beatles Bible, how big it was at the time of the Beatles. But at one time it was part of the Big Five. You know, it was part of EMI Records, Parlophone, Virgin Records, Capitol Records. It was a huge record company. So keep this in mind. So let's go back to the timeline. This gorgeous timeline. So they get a recording audition with EMI Records in front of George Martin, who eventually becomes their producer, on Wednesday, June 6, 1962, not more than 5 months from the signing of their contract with Brian Epstein, who was a former record store employee and furniture store employee who has no background in managing rec groups. This is a pretty good story so far. I would love this to happen to me. Then, so this audition that they go through, pretty much abysmal. I mean, so I've taken this from Beatleshock.com. And if you go to Beatleshock.com, this is, I'll come over here and show this to you. This is Beatleshock.com. This is where I'm getting this from. The Beatles' first EMI recording session, June 6, 1962. Now this is the biggest label, I think, in all of England, if not one of the biggest. So I'm going to summarize here, but there was an engineer who worked there during the sessions, and I'm going to switch back over here. So they go in, and it says on Wednesday, June 6, 1962, the Beatles' rusty white van that they had traveled back and forth from Liverpool to Hamburg somehow rolled into the car park at EMI. All right. And Abbey Road, London, for the first time. Dressed in black leather coats, they unloaded their battered equipment from the van and set up in studio number 2. Now, that's where the Beatles are known to have recorded most of their famous songs later on when they eventually signed with EMI. So they go in there, and this was their first official EMI recording session. I call it an audition. George Martin eventually signed them after this recording audition in March of 62, but I'll get to that in a second here. So they go in, and this is a quote from Smith. Norman Smith was the engineer, one of the engineers during this session. And he said they had duff equipment, which I think duff is slang for crappy equipment. The Beatles seem to have assumed that the staff of Parlophone were wanting to hear their entire repertoire. They did not get very far into the list before engineer Norman Smith stopped them and pointed out that if they were to do any actual recording, then McCartney's distorted bass amp would have to be replaced. So they had shitty equipment. John Lennon probably had his Rickenbacker guitar. I don't know what George was playing, if he even had gotten to Gretsch's yet. I don't know what kind of drum kit Pete Best was playing, and Pete Best was here at the time. This is before Ringo came into the scene. Smith, the engineer, says they had such duff equipment. Now, that's a quote from the Mark Lewison story, The Complete Beatles Recording Sessions. Ugly, unpainted wooden amplifiers, extremely noisy, with earth loops, and goodness knows what. There was as much noise coming from the amps as there was from the instruments. Paul's bass amp was particularly bad, and it was clear that the session wasn't going to get underway until something was done about it. So their amps, their equipment, their guitars are shit. Terrible, horrible equipment. And can you imagine how that sounded hearing them live in the cavern or in Hamburg? I mean, I don't know. I don't know what kind of PA system they were using in Hamburg. It probably wasn't much of anything. So George Martin, who was their future producer, he turned to Norman Smith and said, I'll do my best George Martin impersonation. We've got to do something about this. Technical engineering, Ken Townsend continues. Fortunately, that evening, George didn't like what he was hearing. He says, fortunately, that evening there wasn't a session in Studio One, which meant that the studio echo chamber wasn't in use. So Norman Smith and I went in and carried out the echo chamber's great big Tenoy speaker, which weighed about half a ton. We carried that through. It was on the same floor into Studio 2 for the test. I then fixed up a Leak TL12 amplifier, soldering a jack socket onto its input stage. It wouldn't be considered very high wattage today, but they were quite powerful amplifiers at the time. I think it took about a quarter of an hour to do. We plugged it in, and there was no distortion anymore on the bass guitar, so we used that system for the session. I mean, that seems an awful lot to go through to get these four ragtag group of guys to record a demo. So if I go back over here to BeatlesShock.com, it says, while Smith and Townsend were engineering this repair, the Beatles went for a cup of tea in the studio kitchen. George Martin, not impressed by this carry-on, decided that the Beatles were not worth the effort and took himself off to the canteen, leaving assistant producer Ron Richards in charge. I mean, this is the guy that was supposedly so enamored with them in later years, just drooled when he talked about them, just fawning over what geniuses they were. But when he first heard them, he couldn't take it. I can see this guy, George Martin's like, oh, please, I can't take it anymore. I've got to get out of here. I'm going out for a ciggy at the canteen. You take over, Norman. Or Ron Richards, I'm sorry, Ron, not Norman, Ron. So Richards was more familiar with pop and rock and roll than Martin, who had a background in classical music and comedy. He was the producer for The Goon Show, which featured Peter Sellers and Mike Milligan. Richards explained to the Beatles that rather than work on their way through their list and hope for the perfect take in each song, it would rather be more effective for them to select 4 songs and to perform 4 of them in 4 or 5 takes. And they proceeded to record Besame Mucho, which is a cover, Love Me Do, which is an original, I think Ask Me Why, and I don't remember what the 4th one was. It's not listed here. So the fairy tale continues. These 4 ragtag guys walk into one of the biggest recording studios and record companies in all of England. And they've got George Martin, who's a classically trained musician, who says, fuck it, I can't handle this. It's terrible. They sound awful. Let's get out of here. I'm going to go get sloshed at the canteen. He just gets the hell out of there. He can't take it. So they get through this recording session, and lo and behold, the Beatles signed with EMI on June 18th, 1962. I just don't understand this. Okay, so their initial recording session of Love Me Do, Ask Me Why, Besame Mucho, and one other song takes the better part of an afternoon or a day. They've got to rewire the fucking studio and get them amplifiers in there that work. You know darn well, I think Rickenbacker guitars are crap. I've held them and I've played them. They're terrible. I would never buy a Rickenbacker guitar. So that was Wednesday, June 6th. By the 18th, 12 days later, they signed with EMI on June 18th, 1962. Okay, so let's keep in mind that they were first, they started to go to Hamburg in August of 1960, right? They were nobody's ragtag, leather-clad, ruffian-type, half-assed musicians. That's August of 1962. You're about 3/4 of the way of the year. I'm sorry, August of 1960. Not 1960. August of 1960. Brian Epstein sees them perform in November of 61, a year and a half after that they started playing in Hamburg. They're signed a contract 2 months later to be with Brian Epstein, become their manager in January 62. 5 months later, they get an audition with EMI Parlophone. 12 days later, they sign with EMI. And then in October of 62, okay, so this thing with EMI started in June of 62. 3 months later, they released their first song, Love Me Do, which peaked at number 17. I mean, is this just like a wham, bam, thank you, ma'am? Wow, it's like, holy whiplash, Batman. This is a great story. These guys that had never written a song of the world throw out this song, Love Me Do, that allegedly Paul McCartney wrote when he was like 16. And it just happens. I mean, 17, it broke into the top 20, which is pretty good for a band that's never heard of anything or heard of anyone. Now, think about this. This is shortly before they get their first number one song. But in February of 1963, now they got their first song charted in October of 62 with Love Me Do. And it charted as high as 17. I think that was in the UK charts. I might be wrong. It might be US. I don't think it was. I don't know if it was released in the US. But it peaks at number 17. That's in October of 62. So you go October, November, December, January. So you go October 62, November, December. You got January of 63, February 63. 5 months later, they get the first number one song with their song, Please Please Me. It's number one. Now, I've heard varying stories that it went as high as number 2 and something happened and it bumped up to number 1. There's all kinds of shady dealings, backroom dealings that are going on there. I don't know. So the timeline itself is bizarre. It's lightning fast in the world of entertainment. I mean, this is like wham, 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 wham. So you go from playing in Hamburg from August of 1960, and by February of 63, you've got a number one hit in England. So this August to August of 61 is 1 year. To August of 62 is 2 years. And then just a few months later, so in less than 2.5 years, they had a number one hit. These are 4 guys that are playing in the cellars of horrible, dank bars in Hamburg, Germany, in a bomb shelter in Liverpool, who had only performed like 6 original songs live, just happened to get Love Me Do on the charts, and then Please Please Me that you've never heard before in any other recording prior to this. in Hamburg. No one's got a recording of this live prior to 1963. They just happen to write this great song. It's upbeat, it's poppy, and when it goes to number one. I guess that's a great. I guess if you believe that, you know, I can sell you some really good swampland in downtown Phoenix. Now let's look at the American Billboard charts. Who was charting back then? This is June 30th, 1962. This is who was on the charts in 1962 here in America. The number one song in the Billboard Hot 100, Ray Charles, I Can't Stop Loving You. Now, Ray Charles is a musician. This is a guy who had chops, to say the least. This was a genius. This is a man that sang from the heart. He sang with soul. He played multiple instruments. And to top it off, the guy was blind. You know, this is a freaking genius. Well-spoken, intelligent. I don't know what his personal life was like. I know he'd struggle with a variety of things, including drug addiction. But this is a man who could fucking wail on the saxophone. He could play the piano. He could sing. He could write. He was a genius. This is what the Beatles' competition was at the time of them signing with EMI. Now, some of these other songs in the top 100 are kind of hokey, like The Stripper is a stripper song for burlesque. This song goes, and it's really corny. I heard it for the first time on a local kids TV show here in Cleveland. It was a monster host that would play it when they'd have sexy women come on the screen. Palisades Park by Freddie Cannon. I don't like this song, but it's a very well produced song. Bobby Vinton was a singer, man. This is a singer, and all these people I'm going to mention here, most of them are entertainers. These are the consummate entertainers in America. These were considered like the best of the best in America. The Marvelettes had a song called Playboy, and the Beatles covered one of their songs on, I think, their second album called Please Mr. Postman. And then you got the Everly Brothers, who were all Americana, good looking, two guys who are beautiful blended harmonies. I mean, what I'm saying here is at the time that the Beatles became the Beatles, they somehow went from the deep, dank, grimy, the bowels of Hamburg, Germany, in the Reeperbahn district with these crappy instruments and crappy equipment. And they somehow got discovered by this gay record store owner who had never managed a band. And all of a sudden they're with the biggest record label in England. And within a year of getting number one in the UK with Please Please Me, they had the top 5 spots in the Billboard Hot 100 in America, competing against Ray Charles. And I don't know if Elvis was around yet. I think Elvis might have crapped out because he went into the military, he got drafted, or he went into the army or something. So the story, just, there's so many things that don't add up. Do you think the story adds up? I mean, this is, if you're looking at this from a musician's point of view, I'm like, this is like, wow. This is just like the consummate Cinderella story, you know? And the thing that bugs me the most about the story is, number one, I don't believe it. Something else happened. And I'm not going to go, like Mike Williams will talk about Tavistock. I am not well versed at all. I have a 100,000 foot view of Tavistock and what it is and their influence on entertainment in the world and society. So I'm not going to go down that road. I'll leave that to Mike and some other guys that talk about Tavistock. But something went on other than this story. All of a sudden, I mean, think about this band. From 1963 forward, they were heralded as being geniuses. They eventually kicked Pete Best out. After this EMI recording session, they kicked Pete Best out, or during it or something. They brought in Ringo. They got Ringo Starr in there, which I'm not going to talk about that because it's a whole nother story. But they got a new drummer. They finally became ensconced as the Beatles. And what they did is when EMI signed them, well, I'm kind of jumping around, but when Brian Epstein signed them to be had them signed to be their manager, they agreed to change their look. So they got rid of the leather, and he put them in like Italian suits and Italian boots and the collarless jackets and the whole thing. He cleaned them up, cut their hair, got them to start smoking on stage, and gave them a new presence, gave them the whole new image. And that's how he marketed them. So their image changed. But where did these songs come from? Where did Please Please Me come from? So you're trying to tell me that just under the gun, they get signed to the biggest label in the world, and John and Paul is this toss off Please Please Me? That's the story. I'm not going to go in the story of Please Please Me, but it goes to #1 in the UK. And then we're expected to believe that they just were these genius songwriters that it was schlepping around the ghettos of Germany. And all of a sudden they get signed by EMI, and all of a sudden they're genius songwriters. When all they had written up to that point was Ask Me Why and Love Me Do. I mean, have you ever really listened to Love Me Do? This song is insipid. I'm not going to go into a critique of Love Me Do, but this is my personal opinion of the song. It's insipid, and it's a desperate attempt at sounding pop and bubblegum. It's a horrible song, and I swear today, if the master tapes of that song and every copy of it, every vinyl pressing of it, every MP3 disappeared and was just shot off into the sun, and you could never hear that song again, the world would be a better place. That and Yellow Submarine, if you get rid of those two songs, it would be a better world. These are disgustingly just like songs. So somehow they toss off Please Please Me. They come up with this song. They have the tight harmonies. They come up with this album and their first album, I'm not even going to go there. Their first album, Please Please Me, is like 55% cover tunes. These are genius songwriters at the time. They had 150 songs under their belt. How come they don't have them all on that record album? To close, this is what I think happened. I think this is my non-conspiratorial idea of what I think happened during the EMI signing and prior to and during their audition. I think George Martin somehow became enamored with the boys. I was very enamored with the boys and their cutting sense of humor. And I think he said to them, look, boys, I think you've got something here. I think you've got some charisma. You've got some energy. You've got a presence on the stage. I like your irreverent sense of humor. We're going to write some songs for you. And you're going to say that they're yours. We're going to give them to you. It's part of the deal. You sign with us. We'll give you a couple of songs. You cover some songs. We'll put them on the record. And then we'll market it. If it does well, we'll give you more songs to write. We'll write more songs for you. I truly think George Martin utilized songwriters at his disposal to write songs for them, to craft them after them. And then once he saw that they were getting popularity in England, had a #1 song, all within months, keep in mind. Just within months. This is literally overnight success. I mean, most guys in bands play for years and years and years, like 10 years before they even get noticed. These guys, year and a half, they're at the top, man. If you want to believe that, I'm telling you, if you believe that, send me $5 million and I will introduce you to Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster in one night. I think he made some type of weird deal with them, saying, you don't play all that well. We've got studio musicians that can play for you on the records. No one's going to know that we've got studio musicians. We're going to pay you this amount of money on the contract. We're going to make, pennies on the dollar, pennies on the pound. And we're going to prop you up, put you out there. We're going to put lots of money behind you, but you can't tell anybody we've written these songs for you. But I'm not going to go into all that right now. That's what I really think happened. I don't think the Beatles wrote Please Please Me. I don't think so for a minute. And we'll get into more of that later. So this is I want you to think about this Cinderella story. This is why I want to bring this up here. This is the Cinderella story of the Beatles. take it or leave it. It's a far-fetched story. It's a little bit too hard to believe for me. And later on, I'm going to cover the whole Taylor Swift. The Taylor Swift story is even more unbelievable. It's just completely unbelievable, Taylor Swift. So I'm PTPOP. That's my interpretation of the Beatles Cinderella story. I hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed this video, give me the thumbs up. If not, I know it's going to piss people off because everybody, including myself at one time, you could say nothing about the Beatles bad. And if you did, I would get so upset. I'd be angry, like blood would be just boiling. You put down the Fab Four. How dare you? I'm not like that anymore because they don't believe in the Beatles myth. So there you have it. I'm PTPOP. I'm going to sign off. Have a good day. Peace and love. No autographs, please.
Would you like fries with that? Would you like fries with that?